Welcome to Inflection Point Podcast, where our mantra is cultivating change from the inside out. Join your hosts, Anita Russell, Mavis Bauman, and Gail Hunter, as we create a brave space for conversations about racism, personal transformation, and accountability. Conversation provides a means to dive deeply into your thoughts, ideas, and beliefs, and examine what emerges in your words, actions, and behaviors. The show is a journey towards anti-racism by cultivating change within yourself first and then out into the world. Learn to engage in racial dialogue using 4 tools: courage, conversation, relationship, and accountability. Discover how truth, reconciliation, and healing can emerge from honest and deliberate conversations. Manifest social change right now on Inflection Point Podcast. So thank you for joining us for yet another episode of Inflection Point Podcast. I'm your host, Anita Russell, and here's a quick hello from co-hosts Mavis and Gail.
Hi, I'm Mavis Bauman.
Hi, I'm Gail Hunter. Welcome.
So if you've been following us, we had a particular episode that we did, I believe it was episode 17, which we did back in July. Mm-hmm. And so the conversation that we're having today is kind of a continuation of that conversation, because we had so much information packed in there that we didn't get to, and we want to make sure that we kind of cover all of the topics. So the first portion of today's episode, we're going to give you a quick recap just so you can kind of connect the dots. And if you did not see the last one, at least you'll have a quick overview of what it was we talked about, and you can always go back and check it out.
I think that was, Anita, excuse me, I think it was on July 6th, in case anybody's looking for it.
Absolutely. Thank you, Mavis. So in that particular episode, the topic that we focused on was Juneteenth. But we looked at Juneteenth from the perspective of celebration as well as a need for education. And the reason we say a need for education is because there's so much history associated with that holiday. And a lot of the things that are associated with that are kind of myths, and they're not necessarily truth. So we want to present some truth here. And so that was what we started off when we did this episode, part 1. So we're going to give you a quick recap today. So we had one segment where we talked about, what do you mean free-ish? So around the time of Juneteenth, the celebration and all of that, you may have seen people wearing buttons. I know I have a button, people wearing t-shirts or hats that say free-ish. You might be kind of wondering, what in the world does free-ish actually mean? So part of what we're going to talk about is explain why we consider it to be free-ish, right? So I'm going to start off with a quote. This is a quote from Bryan Stevenson, lawyer, social justice activist, law professor, and founder of the Equal Justice Initiative. Slavery didn't end in 1865. It just evolved. It turned into decades of terrorism, violence, and lynching. Just let that sink in. Because a lot of the myth that's associated with Juneteenth looks at it from the standpoint of that this was the end of slavery. But to Bryan's point, it just evolved. So we're going to go through a little bit of that evolution today. So the core issue with this evolution is a prevailing belief in white supremacy. So it didn't make that belief go away. So because it didn't make that belief go away, we're kind of in this state of free-ish. We're still in that state even today. So one of the milestone events that happened during all of this turmoil that's going on, it's the Civil War, or events that are leading up to the Civil War. And one such event was the Cornerstone Speech, which was delivered in March of 1865 by Alexander Stephens, who was the VP of the Confederacy. So if you remember back in this history, this is when we had a number of states that had seceded from the Union, and the whole entire nation's going crazy at that point. But the Cornerstone Speech delivered by Alexander Stephens was in defense of slavery, number one. It also perceived these differences between the North and the South. And then finally, it was laden with racial rhetoric used to show the inferiority of Black people. So at this point, I'm going to switch it over to Mavis, and she's going to tell us about another important document in that time period called the Corwin Agreement.
Great, thanks, Anita. Yeah, this agreement freaks me out. This was drafted just before the outbreak of the Civil War by Representative Thomas Corwin of Ohio. And in short, it says no amendment should be made that takes the power away, to give Congress the power to take away the rights of the states to have slaves. And they use a euphemism for slavery. It's persons held to labor or service of said state. We all know what they're talking about there. That's, one of those little evolutionary tricks, right? This agreement was actually voted in by the Congress of the United States and the Senate with their pretty high vote. In the Congress, it was 133 to 65. Those numbers kind of surprised me. And the Senate, 24 to 12. After that, the states were expected to ratify them. And in the end, only 4 states did. One state actually went into it, ratified it, and then rescinded it. That particular state was Maryland. And they actually rescinded that ratification. Are you sitting down? In 2014. So this agreement is still on the books for states and could theoretically be ratified. I had no idea about this. So this is really a scary document, trying to, eke out some way of keeping the right to have slaves.
Excellent. And that is such a powerful thing. And it's such an important thing for people to be aware of and understand. And so Gail's going to talk to us about the Emancipation Proclamation and the 13th Amendment, because in actuality, if the Corwin Agreement had been ratified, it would have been the 13th Amendment.
That's right. So the Emancipation Proclamation was in 1863, and it didn't really free slaves. What it was for was really to try to get the Confederacy to come back and join the Union. And so it abolished slavery in those states that left the Union. It did not abolish slavery in all the other states. That was left to each individual state. And so most people don't realize that. I don't think I even realized that until I read some of this. And so that's a significant alteration in what my memory of history has always been. The 13th Amendment was supposed to clarify some of this, but what it did was it abolished slavery except as a punishment for crime. And what then began to happen were all the Black codes that began to occur that in the South, and that they found another way to enslave Black people and to keep them enslaved as working on their farms without having to pay anybody. Whether they had found ways in the Black codes to either arrest them and put them in jail, or to fine them with a fine that they couldn't afford to pay, so they would then be sold to somebody who would pay that fine. So it didn't really free Black people in those Confederate states.
Right. And we were talking about a few weeks ago that if you ask most people who freed the slaves, people would say Lincoln. And these are all the nuances in that process. Fascinating, really fascinating.
Absolutely. And so a lot of times people refer to Lincoln as the great emancipator. And he was an emancipator. It just wasn't for slaves. He was a great emancipator for the Union.
Yes.
Right. And so the Emancipation Proclamation became a very fitting and necessary war measure in that it was suppressing the Confederacy. So essentially, it was a military strategy more than a focus on abolishing slavery. And not to mention the fact that it didn't cover all the states. So there were still some states, those border states, that still had slavery, but they were loyal to the Union. So it didn't touch those people. It only touched those states that had seceded from the Union. So it really didn't serve the purpose of freeing slaves from a moral perspective. It was more from a militaristic perspective, if you will. And so Gail mentioned the 13th Amendment and the abolishment of slavery except as a punishment for crime. And when you go back to the Bryan Stevenson quote, that's exactly what he's referring to, in that the 13th Amendment left the door open for slavery to evolve. Right. And so it evolved into, like Gail talked about, it evolved into Black codes. And then from Black codes, we got Jim Crow. And we have all of these measures that are designed to keep Black people confined and not allow them or have them to experience freedom, right, and that liberation, right?
Just to give a quick little example of how thorough this was, that even if 3 or 4 Black people were talking on a street corner, that would be considered the crime of vagrancy, and they could be pulled into jail. So this is not for major crimes. This is for anything that they, people ruling at the time did not like, and that put them in jail. Put the Black people in jail,
which became the precursor for mass incarceration.
Yes.
Right. And then out of mass incarceration evolves the school to prison pipeline.
Yes.
And so it's all systematically, legalistically woven together. Hence the word free-ish. Okay. Yeah. So one other thing that I wanted to mention in this portion is General Order Number 3, because the General Order Number 3, which came on June 19th, 1865, that's the sort of the standard date for when this happened. And that was when, see, it's been mythologized into, the general riding in on the horse, and he's coming in and he's declaring the slaves are free and all of that. That's not exactly how it happened. So I'm just going to read to you what that order actually said. And then you'll see pieces of it that it's not really freedom that you're getting. It's like a version of, it's like a modified version of chattel slavery, but it's not chattel slavery, but it's not freedom either. It's kind of somewhere in between, right?
And did it just refer to Texas at that point? He was saying
because it specifically says Texas.
People of Texas. All right. Okay.
Right. And also what, based on my reading, it wasn't like this gallant ride into, they kind of came into town and they posted the notices around town and all of that. So what the notices actually said is this: the people of Texas are informed that in accordance with a proclamation from the executive of the United States, all slaves are free. This involves an absolute equality of personal rights and rights of property between former masters and slaves, and the connection heretofore existing between them becomes that between employer and hired labor. The freedmen are advised to remain quietly at their present homes and work for wages. They are informed that they will not be allowed to collect at military posts and that they will not be supported in idleness, either there or elsewhere. So it's already opening up the door to kind of be creative. And how can we manipulate all of this so that we can maintain
Yeah.
the institution of slavery
That's
in a
right.
very evolved kind of way, right?
Sneaky.
Very sneaky.
The
Sneaky,
South
yeah.
was, they were dependent economically on the slaves being able to work their farms and so forth, and that was their economy.
Absolutely.
They
So
had to
that's
take
not an
care of
easy
that,
thing
right?
to just give up, right?
And not only
Right.
that, so they were then allowed to hire them as employees, but that doesn't mean that they paid them fairly or equally at all. So they continue. There are all these different ways that they continue to continue repressing the African Americans.
And then also when I look at the phrase, this involves an absolute equality, but that absolute equality is still relative to the overarching idea of white supremacy. It doesn't negate that at all. So it becomes more this relative equality, hence the word free-ish that I keep emphasizing, because it's not real freedom, right?
No.
Absolute equality either.
Right,
Yeah,
exactly.
right.
That's exactly the point. And it's also interesting to note that this represents such a complicated time in the history of the United States.
Yes, it does.
And being able to kind of look at it and understand it within a 21st century context is very difficult. And what it means is the onus is really on us in the 21st century to kind of take this perspective taking stance, to be able to see and really step into what that experience was, those experiences were like in that time period. Because we have a tendency to kind of take what's in the past and try to retrofit it into the present. Whereas we really should be doing it the other way, where we're taking what's in the present and trying to understand it through the lens of the truth of the past.
For
Which,
everyone affected, right?
yeah, for everyone, absolutely.
Slave owners and slaves, yeah.
Yeah, because this didn't just, none of this just impacts Black people.
No.
Right.
It impacts everybody
Everybody.
in the
yeah.
country. Everybody. And the impact of that is still being resonated today. Very much so. So I've been reading Octavia Butler's book called Kindred. Octavia Butler is this sci-fi kind of writer. It's a Black woman, but she writes science fiction stories and everything. But she writes these scientific stories that address the issue of racism. And this is one such example. And in order to really understand some of this, it's necessary to free ourselves from the grip of racism, because that's the only way that we're really going to be able to move beyond where we are. So in her book, The Kindred, there's two main characters. One of them is a woman. And this woman, one of the tools that Octavia uses in the book is time travel. So she takes this woman in, I believe, let's just say 1976, like somewhere around in that. I believe it's in the 70s. I'm just going to say 76 because that was the year I went to college. So I'm just going to say that. Okay.
Good
so
enough.
If you take a person who is alive, or me alive in 1976, and all of a sudden I am whisked into the 1800s, into the South, onto a slave plantation. So I'm showing up exactly the way I look right now. I got these weird things in my hair. I got these funky looking earrings on, my clothing, look, everything about me does not fit in that time period. And because I don't know how long am I going to be in this time period, I have to learn how to adjust in order to be able to survive. So that kind of explains, in like this sci-fi kind of way, what perspective taking is. It's leaving your present state of mind and going into a different time period to understand that time period within their state of mind, right?
Right.
That's a
That's-
tough thing to do.
It's so tough because when I'm sure this is true for all of us, when we look back, we think, oh, we clutch our pearls and say, I would have never done that. We don't know that.
That's right.
We don't know what they were up against. We don't know how many generations they reinforced this white supremacy or Black inferiority.
Right.
And so it's not helpful to judge them. It's more helpful to look at their perspective, as you say.
Right, exactly. And that is such an incredible point. We are not in a position to judge.
Right, right.
Our focus should be on how do I understand that what was happening in that time period, and to be able to apply that understanding and that awareness to what we're dealing with today.
And how did we get here, right?
That's the tough part. And then the other tough part is how easy it is to hide historical truth.
Yeah, right.
Right? I mean, if you just go back and think about how we were taught history in school, like in elementary school,
right?
How we were taught.
Yeah.
What'd you say, Gail?
I said Lincoln freed everyone, right? He freed
right.
Yeah, Lincoln freed the slaves.
Right. That's right.
So,
and the reality is that they technically, legally, there's a statement that says they are free, but there was nothing that was done back then to help change the belief systems that people had.
absolutely.
And why they felt they needed to attach to them so much to justify the choices that were made and the fear that they had, right? And so nothing was done to change that belief system. We're still working at that.
Yeah.
That is such an incredible point. And it's so true. We are still trying to figure all of that out.
Yes.
Which is why we're in the place that we're in right now. We're in this tug of war. So on the one hand, you got laws that are being made in Florida, as an example, that says it's now against the law to teach something that's going to make a person feel uncomfortable, or that's going to put that person in a state of discomfort. But the truth of the matter is, this is kind of my theme for the month of August, is stepping into your discomfort zone.
Right.
Because we're not going to be able to solve these problems if people are not willing to, number one, understand that privilege is a comfort zone, right? It's the comfort zone. But then there's an edge to that comfort zone. And beyond that comfort zone is where you enter your discomfort zone, because now you're entering into that space where that privilege is being called into question, right? It's that the whole idea, everything that's built around that is now being called into question. And in order for you to be able to deal with that, you got to be willing to step into that discomfort zone. And that's what Inflection Point podcast is all about. It's bringing people into that discomfort zone, because we need to see it. We need to feel it. We need to perceive it. Everything. Otherwise, we just remain stuck. So what do you all think about that? The discomfort zone?
I think that we can't change. It doesn't happen unless we're willing to step out of our comfort zone and into our discomfort zone, right? And that's a hard thing to do for anybody. But if we want to really have equality and justice here, we're going to have to do that and step out of our, as a white person, out of my own comfort zone as being white, and look and see what was really going on back then and how much of that is still playing out even today. And to really look at it from that perspective, like do I look at it from just my perspective? No, I've got to look at it from a person that is Black, and what's it like for them to feel that racism today? I can hear and see now how that must have felt back then. It was horrific. It was still existed in such a strong way. They were not judged equitably, right? They were put in prison for the same thing some white person across the street was doing, right? And so that was fair, and that just opened the door for the black codes to continue and the Ku Klux Klan to develop, and on and on. And so, but even today, talk to anyone, and I know you'll tell me this: how often do you feel something racist occurring? Whether it's a look, whether it's a statement or an absence of something, How many times that I may not ever experience that, but you do. As a woman, I can share that, but not as a Black person.
Right.
Absolutely. Mavis?
Yeah, I tend to want to break it down to relationships, even one-on-one relationships. If there's any rub or disagreement, you have to have a conversation and you have to be uncomfortable. You might have to listen to something that you did that was really unkind or unfair, or brought up something from the past that wasn't relevant, all kinds of things. So to me, going to that place is just a place to learn how we can behave differently and stop hurting each other, whether one-on-one or, rather entire populations.
So we have to move out of that comfort zone in order to be able to hear the other person's
Listen, exactly. Really listen and
listen without that dialogue going on in your head, right? That of what you want to say right back to that person. Listen, hear what that person's saying to you, and let them know when you hear that.
And it can feel really uncomfortable.
Yeah. And imagine for somebody like me who may be experiencing or in the middle of a conversation or something where I'm expressing my feelings, or what does that traumatic thing feel like to me, and a person responds by trying to explain it away. Like, that's the worst thing you can do, is try to explain it away. Oh no, it wasn't really that.
Or even say, well, let me tell you about my thing, because that's
absolutely.
May I apologize for every time I've done that in the past.
And there's a time to share, but you listen and let the person know you hear them first, and you hear what they're saying, what they're feeling.
Exactly. And it really step into that discomfort zone to have these types of conversations around racism. You have to be willing to just shut yourself down and acknowledge the fact that you don't know what you don't know. And that is, Gail, to your point, or I think it was Gail that said it, that's or Mavis, that's a learning space, that discomfort zone. So we're going to stop here. We're going to stop here. And we're going to go to break. And then when we come back, we'll continue this conversation.
Great.
Welcome back. You are listening to Inflection Point podcast on Transformation Talk Radio. I'm Anita Russell, and I'm here with Mavis and Gail. And our topic for this episode is Juneteenth, a cause for celebration and a need for education. And we're examining the question, what do you mean free-ish? So we're going to dive into a different aspect of what we've just been talking about, and just really thinking about the slaves who actually joined the Union Army. And just think about that. Like, you got the whole Emancipation Proclamation going on. And so now if you're in one of those slave-holding states, you've been emancipated and you're free to join the Union Army. So if you could get into the mind of somebody in that time period, a man, because they basically accepted men into the military for the most part, what can you imagine was the motivation behind joining the Union Army? And so the way I see it, it's almost like it was a move of self-emancipation, because we really didn't get emancipated from Lincoln, but being able to be in that battle, the Civil War. And in my mind, I am fighting for my own emancipation and my own liberation from slavery. It's my declaration of liberty, determination for a better life, and all of those things, freedom from racism. And those would be the things that it feels like would be running through your mind. Like, this is an opportunity. What do you think, Gail?
Yeah,
Definitely.
willingness to fight for freedom.
Right.
In spite of what you just come through.
Right.
I'm sorry, Gail, I walked on you again.
I was just saying that there was such an intention and willingness to fight for themselves, but also to fight for their families, for their communities.
Absolutely. And it was also, when we go back to some of the earlier documents,
Mhm.
I'm fighting for my liberty. I'm
Mhm.
fighting for the pursuit of my own happiness,
Mhm.
just by virtue of the fact that I am a human being.
Right.
That's what gives me that right to fight for my
Right.
own emancipation, right?
Mhm.
And also fighting for future generations. I don't want my children's children's children to be in the conditions in which I have been for generations. I can trace my generations back,
Right.
children that were lost, parents that were lost, and all of that. So, for the sake of my future generations,
Right.
I
They
need
have to
this
do it.
freedom and this liberty,
Mhm.
right?
Right.
Willing
So
to
their future
sacrifice for it.
generations won't have to experience the suffering that they did, and the losses and grief that they did, and the horrors that they also did experience. Yeah, for all.
Right. Exactly. All of that.
But
All of that. But also that pursuit of happiness, right? That's my economic happiness. That's
Mhm.
my emotional happiness,
Mhm.
you know,
Safety.
my safety, all the
Right.
things that we
All
talked
of it.
about way back when we were talking about the social determinants of health.
Mhm.
Right.
I want
All
all
of it.
that.
Mhm.
I want all that in a bag
Like
of
anybody else.
Right. Yeah. You want what everybody wants, right?
right, right.
Just wanted that equal share of what everyone had a right to, and
Mhm.
everyone should have had a right to.
Exactly. And
But it was
none of
taken away.
that should be denied
Mhm.
just by virtue of a person's skin tone. That just should not be.
Mhm.
And so when I think about that fight starting, going back to the Civil War and people making those decisions to join up with the Union Army and all of that, we're on a similar battlefield
Mhm.
today.
Mhm.
It's not a bloody battlefield like it was then, but it's a battlefield because we're still fighting for the same exact thing, that pursuit of happiness, that freedom from racism. For me in 21st century, Anita Russell, that's the big thing for me:
Mhm.
freedom from racism, oppression, and inequity,
Right.
right?
And if we think of it as we're all fighting for the same thing too.
Mhm.
Since we want the same things, it's not an us against them battle. It doesn't have to be. We should all be fighting against racism because it affects each and
Everyone.
every one of us.
Exactly. Right. When I make a statement or judgment about another, I make it about myself more than anything. And so if I condemn, I'm condemning myself. So we all need to be aware of that when we sit in that kind of judgment of another, it's not going to do us any good any more than it's going to do the person we're judging. Oh.
Truth.
That's so true. That is
Yep.
so true.
Mhm.
Then you can look at it from the standpoint that they were also fighting for freedom that was denied.
They're
And if
fighting
you
for
recall,
truth.
when we had J.K. Bridges, our last guest, and she talked specifically about how some of that denial shows up in
Mhm.
wives, military husbands, military spouses in general.
Mhm.
Um, when military individuals are transitioning out of that environment and into the civilian environment, the discrimination that they experience.
Mhm.
And these are people that, or if you think back in World War I, II,
Mhm.
when Black soldiers were there fighting on the front lines, and then they come home and they, like, I went to fight for freedom and democracy.
They didn't
And then
receive.
I come back here, and that freedom and democracy that I was fighting for is denied to me. I was on the battlefield.
Mhm. Well, even World War II, they didn't get the benefits that the white veterans got.
Right,
Until
exactly,
recently. Yeah,
exactly.
they changed that.
Right.
Yeah.
So it's interesting how that phenomena connects, or that social phenomena even connects to
Mhm.
the the enslaved joining the Union Army, that they were going to fight for this particular thing, but then that particular thing that they were fighting for was systematically and institutionally denied.
Yeah. Like the GI Bill. I mean, I don't know what the stats are for that today, but people coming back from Vietnam, Korea, they didn't receive the benefits.
Well, anyone that was
soldiers received. They weren't given the federal housing loans so that they could buy a home and start to accumulate wealth. You know, I think people don't think about, or at least I haven't thought about, those different ways to deny the freedom. I'm not going to give you a loan for your house. That means you are going to be chasing rentals your whole life. You're not going to have control over your environment.
Yeah. And that, what you just said, we talked about that when we did the episode on redlining. Right. When we really took a deep dive into redlining. Yeah.
That was the government doing that initiated that. And so when you look back historically, the government was always back there behind all this somehow, either in what words they used or didn't use. Right. But left those openings, for discrimination and racism to continue.
Right. And under that fighting for freedom denied is the issue of fear. And Gail, you talk about this a lot, that fear in a lot of ways is the biggest enemy in this country.
It is.
Because and when that fear is associated with white supremacy and white nationalism, January 6th, and all of those, it just brings to the forefront that we're not done. So it's almost like we're in another reconstruction, if you will. And I want to read this quick quote. So you know how people say fear is an acronym for false evidence appearing real? Right. I think the flip side of that is real evidence appearing false. Right. Because if you look at the election, you know, the election deniers, if you look at all of these types of things where you lost, you simply lost. That's right. There's evidence that you lost. And you're turning that evidence into something false. But that's still, to me, associated with this fear of loss, and all of that. And so this is the quote I wanted to say. The worst form of fear is the gloomy thoughts that create an eerie atmosphere inside of one's mind. And I got this when I was looking up the FDR quote, the only thing we have to fear is fear itself. And then I read this poem analysis thing, and it was going through and really kind of breaking it down. And that was one of the statements that they had in there. The worst form of fear is the gloomy thoughts that create that eerie atmosphere inside of one's mind. To me, that's like a definition, one of those definitions of white supremacy.
And of racism as well.
And of racism.
I have these beliefs and they cause me to have gloomy thoughts and fear.
And they justify my behavior then.
Absolutely. Yeah. Absolutely. So here's another interesting way of looking at that. So everybody's familiar with the idea of assimilation, right? And this idea that the United States was supposed to be this melting pot, like people would come from everywhere and then everybody just gets melted into this pot of sameness where everybody is just the same, right? So, but what if we were to look at assimilation in a different perspective? Because when you look at where we are in 2022, this country is more diverse and more multicultural today than at any point in its history. So one could argue that it's time for the assimilation to occur in the reverse direction, because this is what the country actually looks like.
That's right.
So that assimilation now is this whole white supremacy thing being dismantled, and now that assimilation is into the true form of what this country is, and that is a multicultural nation.
Exactly.
Right?
Which is what makes us unique and such a special place. You know, you go to areas of the country where there's no ethnic food, no
right.
cultural impact, and it just doesn't feel like home. It just becomes monolithic.
Absolutely.
Yeah, I love that idea, Anita, of assimilating to who we really are instead of holding on to the past.
Right.
Design, really.
Well, fear never tells us the truth, right? Fear always tells us lies or distortion.
Good one.
And so if we aren't willing to look at what the truth is and we access and attach to fear, often the very thing we are afraid of is what we will manifest to create. And that's not going to be a good thing, as you were describing what happens in the mind, right? The more I think about something in fear, that's fear-based, the more I'm going to experience that, the more I'm going to see that, perceive that. And the more I see and access truth that comes more from love and acceptance, the more I'm going to experience that also. And so it's about seeing that truth, right? And the truth is we are a multicultural nation, and white population is going to become in the minority if you're looking at that demographically over the next 20 years. And that's okay. That's wonderful. That means that we are that diverse. And it's time that we grow our systems to begin to catch up to that truth.
Yes. It's just, I mean, all of this stuff is just so interesting. And when you think about everything that we just talked about and then connect it back to that discomfort zone, that fear is a part of that discomfort. So if you're going to move beyond that, that means you have to be willing to move through the fear. You have to be willing to understand the fear, right? In order for you to be able to abolish the fear.
And the fear is going to be based in some distorted belief system.
Right.
We'll uncover that and reframe that, fear will go away.
Right.
So exactly. Discomfort into more comfort. Yeah.
So I wanted to kind of switch a little bit and talk about the whole idea of Juneteenth being a celebration, because I can understand the celebratory aspect of it. You just have to know the real historical significance and the truth of it at the same time. But I can understand it from the standpoint of celebrating our struggles for freedom, going back all the way back to enslavement, going all the way back to the transatlantic slave trade. We've celebrated the sacrifices. We give thanks to all of those people who lived and died on our behalf, paving the way. And so those soldiers who joined the Union Army were paving the way for things to be different for me today, right? But then there's also that reality that's associated with Juneteenth, which does necessitate the educational aspect, the historical truth, to understand, to Bryan Stevenson's point, the evolution of slavery and where we are now. So the term free-ish is there because freedom in that sense is relative to white supremacy. And if it's relative to white supremacy, it still is freedom denied.
Right, exactly.
And that's kind of where we are. That's where I see that we are, right? And so when you think about the social reality of freedom in relative relative or legalistic terms, it does not equate to that liberty, that freedom, that equity, that pursuit of happiness. It doesn't equate to that at all.
No.
Right?
Right. And I think this is so important to keep that perspective. And I also think it's important to celebrate that for what that really was, which was the belief that this is what was going to be, even though it wasn't, but that the possibility is still there and the reality of it must be here now, that you can celebrate. It was a major step, but it was not the complete step.
Right.
Right. Absolutely. Absolutely. So let's switch it up a little bit and let's talk about the movement from the 13th Amendment to the Abolition Amendment, because there might be people out there who are not familiar with the Abolition Amendment. So we've already talked about how the 13th Amendment kind of ushered in the evolution of slavery with the, codified things that were codified, crimes were codified into black codes, and you got Jim Crow and, all of those types of things. But then in December of 2020, three senators, Chris Van Hollen, Jeff Merkley, and Representative William Lacey Clay, proposed a constitutional amendment to close the slavery loophole in the 13th Amendment. So I'm going to read you that statement. The 13th Amendment abolished most, but not all slavery, permitting slavery to or involuntary servitude as a punishment for crime. The Abolition Amendment would finally finish the job started by the Civil War, Emancipation Proclamation, and the 13th Amendment, and end the morally reprehensible practice of slavery and forced labor in America, and send a clear message. In this country, no person will be stripped of their basic humanity and forced to toil for somebody else's profit.
Right.
Yeah. This is less than 2 years ago, this language was written.
Exactly.
Less than 2 years ago. Oh my gosh. And it's still waiting for, pardon?
It's still waiting. Yeah.
Yeah. Like, that seems like that could pass in a minute.
Exactly.
I'm not sure why it doesn't, but
yeah, I don't know either. But that is fascinating. That's just that, things like this language have to be put in place so that we are not sliding backwards every generation or two. Roe versus Wade shocked so many people. This can happen in so many different places, as we've discussed. So let's close the door.
Yes, exactly. So here's a really powerful quote from Senator Merkley. The exception to the 13th Amendment's ban on slavery corrupted criminal justice into a tool of racial control of Black Americans and other people of color. And we see that legacy every day in police encounters, courtrooms, and prisons throughout our country. Slavery is incompatible with justice. No slavery, no exceptions. That's so powerful.
It's so powerful.
So there probably are people out there who may not even be aware of that. And the way that I became aware of it is because if you know anything about me, I hang around like all these historians, and I'm a member of the Association for the Study of African American Life and History, or ASALH. And so that's where I get a lot of my information from, college professors and historians and all of that, to kind of give me the information that I can now pass on through InflexionPoint podcast.
Right.
Yeah. That's such a fabulous statement to read and reread when people challenge the effect of slavery today. This is hitting it right on the head, the control of Black Americans. That's how it connects.
You didn't read
that's exactly how it feels to us.
The first part of that statement from Senator Merkley, you didn't read, but I think it's really important. America was founded on beautiful principles of equality and justice, and horrific realities of slavery and white supremacy, right? And if we are ever going to fully deliver on the principles, we have to directly confront those realities, which is what we were talking about before. Are we going to listen to those distorted beliefs, or are we going to look at what the truths are?
Exactly. And again, it gets back to that whole entire thing of real evidence appearing
Exactly,
forward.
that's right, right.
Right? And because that statement, I said it earlier, it speaks so powerfully to where we actually are right now. When I think back on January 6th, everybody, so I've said it earlier that there's two things in recent years, from 2020 to 2020, 2021. That was 2021, January 6th, right? Yeah. So in that year, so it started with George Floyd. Most people are going to remember where they were or what they were doing when they first heard about that. Then in 2020, when we were full blown under COVID, everybody's at home, everybody's watching television, everybody's going to remember what their first response was in watching the January 6th insurrection.
Right.
Most Black families, the first thing that popped into our minds, where are the police?
And my first thought was, if this was a crowd of Black people, those police would have been there right like that. Was the first
Exactly,
thing.
because they would have been there in advance.
That's right.
They would have been there. We got about 3 more minutes.
Exactly.
Yeah, we got about 3 more minutes left. I know we always run out of time. We always run out of time. But we covered a lot today.
Yes, we did.
Definitely covered a lot. So what I'd like to do at this point is just take some time out just to call out some of the things that we're actually doing besides Inflection Point podcasts, websites, and all that sort of thing. So what I would also recommend for our audience is that you go and visit the websites of Senators Holland and Merkley and Representative Clay to learn more about the Abolition Amendment, because that's part of the reason we're talking about this, is because people need to know that this is something that is coming down the pipe. And if it gets the approval, it will go to the states to be ratified. Right? Something that we really need to be focused on. So definitely go visit those websites. And then we have launched a brand new Facebook group for Inflection Point Podcast. So if you just go on facebook.com/groups/Inflection Point Podcast, you can apply to become a member and join in. Eventually, I'd like to have conversations with people who are following us at that point. And then you can also go to my website, check out other things that I do besides Inflection Point Podcast. I do a lot of anti-racism work. I do coaching. I'm a transformation, a personal transformation expert. theplacetosoar.com. So Mavis, take it away.
I'm president of Seed a Better Life, which is an organization that supports the education, feeding, and medical care for people in Rwanda that are still impacted by the 1994 genocide. I really try to bring my learnings from the tribal struggles in Rwanda to our country and how othering can be so devastating. So check out my website, seedabetterlife.org. Thank you.
Yeah.
I'm president of OMA, Center for Mind, Body, and Spirit. It's under www.omapittsburgh, that's OMA, Pittsburgh.org. We offer holistic education and lecture series. We do trauma-informed training. We have a trauma survivor panel discussion. We have a youth program that's trauma-informed, and a variety of other things that please feel free to look on our website and see what all we're about. Thank you.
Excellent, excellent. So I just want to leave you with these final words from FDR. We have nothing to fear but fear itself. So thank you for joining us for another insightful conversation on Inflection Point Podcast. And you can catch us here on Transformation Talk Radio every first and third Wednesday of the month, 3 p.m. Pacific, 6 p.m. Eastern. And we'll see you on the next episode. Thank you for listening to Inflection Point Podcast, where our mantra is cultivating change from the inside out. The journey towards anti-racism and social change doesn't stop here. Truth, reconciliation, and healing come from ongoing, open, honest, and deliberate conversations. Continue to dive in and deconstruct your thoughts, ideas, and beliefs as we band together to manifest social change. Tune in to Inflection Point Podcast every first and third Wednesday at 3 p.m. Pacific, 6 p.m. Eastern, here on TransformationTalkRadio.com for more conversations about how we can cultivate change from the inside out.